So we
Stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch with fake people. Great.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of TRD Talks Live with The Real Deal. I'm Hiten Santani, TRD's associate publisher, and today we're going to be having a very interesting discussion about some of the structural changes that are probably needed in the real estate industry on an industry level as well as on a policy level going forward. And we have two speakers who are going to share their insights, their solutions, but also some of the concerns about some steps if we don't take, we might be in a long-term pickle. So I'm joined today by Barika Williams, who's the executive director of the Association for Neighborhood Housing Development. It's an organization that advocates for affordability and equitable neighborhoods throughout New York City. We also have Adam Weinstein, who is the CEO of Phipps Houses, which is one of the largest affordable housing nonprofit developers in the nation, primarily focused on New York City. We're obviously speaking, I don't want to get into the unprecedented discussions, but let's just assume that is the case. What I think is exciting and interesting is that we're in a situation where a lot of the conversations that needed to be had about inequality, about marginalization, are now at the forefront. You know, there's a sort of always been a side table discussion about some of these conversations, but now it's very much in the center. And we're going to discuss what this means on an industry level and a government level. So again, Hiten Santani with The Real Deal, joined by Barika Williams and Adam Weinstein. It's one thing to rename a street or, retire or a racist logo, but it's another thing altogether to examine some of these things on a structural level. So Barika, Adam, thank you for joining us. Hannah, they're still on mute. There you go. Now we're live. Adam, can I hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Okay, Barika, let's start with you. In terms of the positive this is a moment of reckoning conversations from a housing perspective. What have you seen that's given you the most encouragement?
So I think, first off, thanks, Hiten, for having me. I think it's some of what you talked about in the intro of people really starting to actually have these conversations and formats like this that hopefully are pushing all of us to not just have the once a moment conversations, the change the street, the put up a sign, but really say, what are the structures that we need to change? How does this change the way we think about policies? How does this change the way money flows? How does this change, for example, height of the moment, New York City budget allocations, which is literally unfolding today. Yeah. And hopefully that creates the space for us to really start to transform our systems, as opposed to sort of have this as a moment and then the moment is gone. I think that's really a piece that is core for me and core for ANHD, is that if this is just a moment and we don't build on it and we don't create something different, it's really a moment that we lost and didn't properly utilize.
Mm-hmm. Adam, you've also seen, many ups and downs in New York City. You've seen many sort of calls for change. What's different this time?
I think the degree of the crisis is more than just an economic one at this point. There's been a lot of discussion in the last decade, really, of the unintended consequences, the unintended beneficiaries and the unintended non-beneficiaries of city housing policy. And while I think I'm going to find myself agreeing with 90% of what Barika says, having been a ANHD member for many, many years. The other 10% relates to what can be expanded, what can be changed in ways that are more than just marginal. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll build out from there.
So let's talk. I mean, Barika, you sort of alluded to this immediate thing that we're dealing with, which is the budget. And there's been something that has upset a lot of affordable housing advocates, which is there's a call to slash the capital budget for housing by up to 40%, which would, I think my last count was about 21,000 apartments would be affected. Former Deputy Mayor Alicia Glenn had called this a very short-sighted, penny-wise, pound-foolish decision. I wanted to get your thoughts on that and what can they do? The city does have to watch its expenditure at this point. So what needs to be done that can preserve this sort of march toward affordable housing that we had for a while, given the constraints that they have?
So I think this is one place where we're in a very unique moment because you have everything from Deputy Mayor Glenn, the Real Estate Board of New York, ANHD, supportive housing, legal service providers, all consistently saying the same thing, that this is incredibly, incredibly short-sighted of the administration. Specifically, though, this is from the city capital budget. This is not from the operating budget. So this is money that is bonded over time. It does not equal a big savings in the budget gap today, but it has huge ramifications for affordable housing, for jobs, for development, for affordability, for stability of neighborhoods for years to come. And so there's really this question of why is this administration making this policy decision right now, not just the financial decision, but the policy decision to step away from affordable housing that adversely impacts Black and brown neighborhoods in this moment in time. It just really doesn't, for many of us, it really doesn't make sense. And I think the thing that is incredibly powerful, but also unusual and shocking and very telling is that it doesn't seem to make sense to almost everybody.
Right, it's the chorus of voices that have come to criticize this is a bit unusual if you look at the cast of characters. Adam, what do you think about that? I mean, what's your thought beyond, if this is a short-sighted decision, what is a way around that? What is something that could be done?
It feels pretty binary to me. I don't know if there's a way of skirting the reality of providing affordable housing in New York. The story I always tell is one of our board members, who shall remain nameless, but is a large, a scion of a large real estate family, had just joined our board 15, 20 years ago, and we're driving around the Bronx looking at properties, and he says, as you would expect a market rate developer to do, well, Adam, is it about sites or is it about financing? And of course, at that time, 20 years ago, you could throw a rock and hit a site. And I said to him, it's entirely about financing. It's not about finding land. And it still is that case. In fact, we find ourselves in today's world having far too much supply of shovel-ready projects for the city to finance, even without those capital cuts. So I don't see some magic bullet. I do think, and I share the view that, this is to some degree a guns and butter, what the guns versus butter choice. I'm not a budget expert, city capital budget expert or city expense budget expert, but it takes so long to develop the affordable housing that we do have. Phipps has a pipeline that is taking us probably till 2030. And we're still adding to it because there is really no other choice. Unless you believe, and I don't share this view, that the city is going to return to a depopulation of the 1970s that I lived through. I don't see that happening. I still see it as a place that is an attractive place for culture and for business. It is a place where population will remain high. If you think that for some reason the city's fortunes are going to change, then sure, there's a reason to reduce your supply of housing. But right now it remains a complete structural imbalance between supply and demand.
I think there was an argument that the city was making, which is, hey, we've sort of exceeded our targets already for the year, so we're going to sort of chill out for a bit. That was sort of the gist of what they said. So get your take on that.
Go ahead, Barika.
No, I'll let you take that one. You go ahead.
I think, look, I have enjoyed working with this administration. I've enjoyed working with prior administrations. That sounds to me like, if you ask a question with a dagger, you're going to get a defensive answer. I don't think certainly the senior housing officials and the deputy mayor, I'm sure, are looking at are being judicious in their response.
I think the other piece of that, though, is that that's a problem, and I look at policy and especially what other places and what we can learn from best practices. one thing we do see, not just that we've learned from previous crises, but from other cities around the globe, is that the time to invest in affordable housing is when you hit an economic downturn, especially given that one of our struggles is sites. This is one of the moments where, you know, when Adam and others and ANHD members are saying we're struggling to find sites, and there are some developers who are like, we want to walk away from this building or part of our portfolio. It's an opportunity for us as a city and us as communities to pick up very valuable affordable housing sites. For them to not invest in the financing to do that is a huge lost opportunity.
Because those deals, I guess, aren't competing with the kind of deals they'd be competing with in a strong market. Right?
Exactly.
Well, there's definitely been I mean, I can comment a little bit on that. I think fundamentally Barika is absolutely correct. I do think there's a little micro phenomenon going on. It's much more sort of transactional. I think there's still a little bit of, what's the right word? I think that people are fearing seller's remorse. It is always easier to purchase property after a market has tumbled and feels like it's back on the rise. Because then sellers of buildings, land are feeling expansive. Right now, they're feeling remorseful. Ooh, I missed my moment. And I can illustrate, you know, with examples of properties that we've made offers for. We offered, you know, top of the market price. It's been 6 months. That price has been sitting on the shelf, and it's still there. We're still offering the same number, and yet the seller is having an irrational question as to whether he has somehow missed the boat in some way.
Okay.
It doesn't make logical sense. I think a few months of shakeout will change that.
Since we have an audience that is also composed of brokers and people who are in the asset sales sort of business, what kind of conversations are you able to get through to them so that they can get through to sellers at this point?
We generally don't buy through brokers. We buy off market. I mean, I
see a big smile in your face.
I don't know what it's like to be a broker these days. It must be a terrible undertaking. But sure, of course, you know, I think assembling land, as Barika also said, this is a multi-year undertaking. Just assembling the land is a multi-year undertaking. And so you asked earlier, like, what strategies? This is an excellent moment to begin assembling that capacity. You know, the city used to make pre-development funds available to members, you know, of ANHD. It no longer does that. I wanted to
ask about some of those other alternate vehicles. There's been talk about, you know, community land trusts and if more money could flow into them. Barika, any thoughts on other sort of vehicles to generate the kind of money you need to create this housing?
No, I mean, I think we absolutely support the idea of these other vehicles, whether that's community land trusts, whether that's tenant opportunity to purchase, where tenants can work themselves to purchase or can work with a nonprofit or community-based organization. I actually did one of the first TOPA deals in DC many, many years ago. But I think really what we're seeing is an eagerness and a desire, both coming from community members and coming from many of the community actors that have been developing in neighborhoods over time, that they really need to have a better role in shaping what is happening and what development looks like in communities. I think we are at prior to COVID, we're at a very clear moment where there was a question about who's going to be in charge of what a neighborhood looks like over time, and where communities were starting to say, if you think as to city government that you can shape this entirely without us having feedback, we'll just stop it. And I think it's a concerning place for everybody to get to say no development. New York City had never been to the place of saying no development. We don't want any development. That happens in other parts of the country where they're like, no affordable housing, none of this, we don't. And for us to start to approach that, I think clearly shows that we're not approaching this correctly. We're not pursuing it right.
Right, and I want to come back to something about planning in a second, but Adam, you had one of your projects in Sunnyside, I think about 210 units in Sunnyside, was sort of, you abandoned that project. There was a lot of community opposition. You did not? Okay,
Did not abandon it.
Tell me the latest on that. The reason I ask is because, again, so New York City had been making this push toward density. Density had been a largely positive word in the conversation in New York for the last decade. There is some fear about density now, given how badly hit we were by the crisis, given our sort of the public health, not necessarily grounded fears, but people are worried about being in denser, more crowded spaces. So I wonder if that's going to be a hindrance for the kind of affordable housing that we need to see to get through this crisis.
I think the density argument is this is not an original thought. Everyone has written about this, is a misconception.
Mm-hmm.
The risk is created by cohabitation or occupancy of large spaces. I mean, as we learn more about the spread of the disease, it certainly hasn't been, the fact that you have an apartment building versus a private home. It's gatherings.
Yeah.
I'll cite, while it is an absolute tragedy to have even a single fatality as a result of COVID, in our portfolio, a very, very dense portfolio of property, our ratio was probably a third of the New York City rate, probably 20% of the Bronx rate, and possibly even a lower, I haven't done the calculation of what the relationship in our zip codes is. And these are Black and brown communities of color, that have been ignored to a large extent. Yeah. And our buildings are the largest buildings there. And as to point to density as
I'm talking less about the science of it, which I think you're on the right track, but I'm talking more about the perception of it and maybe the difficulty of getting something like that funded.
I mean, we'll see. The city hasn't had land use hearings in a very long time. Mm-hmm. To answer your earlier question, we were poised to be certified for a revised project in Sunnyside. I think that was an exception. We've probably gone through 9 or 10 rezonings in the last administration. We welcome the public process. We think it's a good one. We like the feedback we got. We think the project that we're proposing is a better one than the prior one, with deeper affordability, which wasn't even something the community asked for, but we believe in it. So I don't think that people are going to all of a sudden become allergic to density.
Okay. That's good to hear. Barika, back to you. You had done a really interesting interview with RPA, and you said this thing that I want to ask you a little bit more about and get your take on. You said planning centers whiteness as the preferred form and function, right? That's a pretty powerful statement to make. It seems like you've thought about that quite a lot. I want to understand what you meant by that, and also how you could sort of break that and reimagine that. So let's hear that from
I think, so I would say I'm an urban planner, I went to planning school, and for many of us really going from grad school in planning to practicing planning and being in these various different spaces, it's really understanding that a lot of what we're taught and then a lot of what is being instituted is this sort of, as a very white, wealthy, straight, hetero ideal of what neighborhoods are supposed to look like, how they're supposed to function, how you're supposed to gather, right? Everything from what people envision as stoops. New York Times just had something around stoops. And I was like, people have been using stoops for generations. Like, how is this a new conversation?
Times blew the cover off stoops.
Like, I'm very confused by this, right? So I think we really have to recognize and understand that if we are saying we value diverse communities and we value diverse neighborhoods, that we have to plan in a way that includes their diversity and includes their culture for what we're trying to create. Not trying to create Chelsea or the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side in Astoria or in East New York or in Bushwick. And that's a lot, honestly, of what we try to do in planning.
But planning, Barika, is sort of a dance between the government side of things, which may kind of pick up your point, and also the industry, which, and I think I mentioned this, how many Black developers do you know? How many Black lenders do you know? How many Black, I can think of one Black executive who's at the top of a real estate investment vehicle. Okay, one. So don't you think it's a function of both the representation within the industry and then the policies from the government? So how would you encourage more participation in the for-profit real estate industry? Because that's kind of where a lot of this flows from, right?
Well, so one thing I would note is I would say there's a question there around the for-profit caveat, because what I will say is in our nonprofit sector, we actually probably have more Black and brown executive directors than people will recognize. And I think there's a big barrier in terms of advancement and matriculation in the for-profit sector than there is maybe more generally. But period, we need representation matters. We need more representation in the real estate sector overall. But I think the planning, whether it's from the government side or whether it's from the developer side, there's going to be barriers to increasing representation if what you are doing when you step into that sector, when you step into that job, you feel like you're not lifting up the community that you come from and that you oftentimes got into this work to do, right? So I don't want to be in a position where I'm doing urban planning in a way that I feel like isn't powerful and isn't supportive of Black communities. And I don't think we're ever going to be successful in seeing expanded representation in private firms, in design firms, in real estate positions, if people feel like that's what they're being asked and forced to do by taking on those positions.
Okay, fair enough. And on the planning side again, so the city had a really interesting analysis. I think they published it this morning, which was looking at the sort of the jockeying for extremely low income apartments. I think it was 650 applications for every apartment available, but at the highest range of that sort of affordable index, there was a lot less competition. And I think one of the things is that in general, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of advocacy for a greater percentage of affordable housing in new developments, right? Maybe the conversation needs to be a greater percentage of the extremely low income and the very low income ones, and settle for a lower percentage overall. What do you think of that? And whoever wants to take that on can.
So I think I'd say we have been doing that, except for the lower percentage overall. So we've been pushing for deeply affordable housing, which for us is ELI, VLI, extremely low income, very low income, and that the focus really needs to be on that. I think though what you're highlighting in the numbers is a bigger problem in our overall real estate market, which is that we are sort of constantly doing this. If you build it, they will come. We're building for people in hopes of attracting them. And I think there's a real recognition now in light of COVID that there's a lot of risk in that. I mean, Adam can speak to this, but there's in the affordable housing sector and in the truly affordable units that match people's income, there's not a lot of risk in filling the units. Right.
But if you're picking the fight about overall number of units that need to be affordable, or let's get the most units that will cater to the people who most need this, judging by the demand and judging by their resources. If you pick both fights, maybe you don't get what you need as much.
Well, so I would say we generally, we're always committed to obviously as much affordable housing as possible, but we also recognize that the ability for the affordable housing to have the impact that we want and to impact people's lives is tied to it being actually affordable to New Yorkers that our communities and our groups serve, which is why we focus on deeply affordable units. That balance of how much of what in which building is not, we don't necessarily take that on building by building, because that's a conversation for the community to have with that developer, or for the community to have with city planning in that site, because I personally don't want to be in the position of me sitting in my sort of little tower making that decision for any other community, the same way I don't think it's helpful for the city to make that decision for another community.
Luckily, we do have a developer here, so let's hear from him. What do you think about that in terms of the income levels, as opposed to, focusing the fight more on the income levels as opposed to the overall number of quote unquote affordable units?
Well, I think the fight has been heard, or the fight has been adopted, and is part of the narrative. I agree with Barika's comment that one size fits all for, downtown Brooklyn versus East New York versus Port Morris is a terrible way to go about serving the need of your customer, let alone financing. And that's certainly not how we view any building that we undertake. It's what is the demand going to be here? And despite the fact that there are 650 or 450 or whatever, I mean, there's a little bit of falseness in the reporting of those numbers.
But the overall trend is, it stands, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, you'll get the same 450 to 650 applicants for units pretty much underneath the area median income for 80 or 90% AMI units as well. But once you start going above those numbers, I think you do get sort of a drop off in demand.
Can you make the numbers work? You're a nonprofit developer, but you can't operate in the red, right? Could you make those numbers work if it was much more?
What are those numbers?
As in, could you make a development that is tilted much more heavily towards extremely low income and very low income units work, you think?
Well, we do. Most of the developments that we're building now are under the city's ELA program. But there are tweaks for sure that recognize financing constraints. I'd also like to turn the conversation a little bit away from just being a developer, because my standard line is that development is sex, but owning and operating these buildings for a long time is love.
Point, yeah. Right.
And we do have history, and Phipps has been around since 1905 and has done every affordable housing program available. And we have examples of buildings that we did in the late 1980s, early 1990s, part of the Koch program, that were 50% homeless households, 50% low-income households. And the reality is that in some regards was a poor model, and not necessarily from the standpoint of serving an immediate need. It was a crisis. And of course, we wanted to respond to the crisis. But the level of operating support for a building like that is significant. And in times, I distinguish capital support versus the long-term sustainability of buildings. I want our buildings to look as good, to provide as much service, to provide as much enjoyment, and in this time, shelter. Whenever has shelter been more needed? 60 years from now, not get to a closing, but 10 and 15 and 20 and 30 and 40. That to me is the long-term solution. If you're playing for the refinancing, we're wasting our money. We're just arguing over today's problem. And
it's a very fair point to think about your portfolio sort of generationally.
And it's not, look, we're building only in East New York, Far Rockaway, South Bronx. There are households clamoring at 80 and 90% of the area median income who are completely priced out of those markets. It's sad. It kills me when, a young teacher, right, or a health worker, an essential worker can't afford to live in that neighborhood. How else are we going to supply the service that neighborhood needs?
Right. It looks like we've got some people who joined in a little bit more recently. So again, I'm Hiten Simtani with The Real Deal. We're joined today by Barika Williams from NHD and Adam Weinstein from Phipps Houses. We're talking a little bit about structural changes that could come to the real estate industry to boost affordability and bring in much needed change. Barika, you've been on the state side as well. So one of your previous lives, you worked for Governor Cuomo on his housing team. Can you give us maybe a former insider's perspective on the city and state coordination needed in a moment like this and whether that is happening?
I'm not sure.
Sorry with that.
I'm not sure I can say whether or not it's happening. I think on even the best of days, coordinating between two big government bureaucracies and entities is difficult. They have I mean, just thinking about the affordable housing side of things, they have their own term sheets, they have their own asset management teams, they have, I think in some ways a little bit, we're a little bit at an advantage in the housing side of things, and when it comes to affordable housing, because they've learned over time that they need to be coordinated. So HCR, the state housing entity, and HPD, the city housing entity, and their various financing divisions often have money in the same deal and in the same building over time, and so have really worked long before I got there to figure out how to be coordinated, to make sure that they're not overlapping and duplicating their resources, but then also making sure that they're not hopefully underserving a building. But then you throw in COVID and you throw in a massive crisis, and everybody sort of scrambles, you know, and I think that makes things complicated, right? We've got a pool of money that the state announced that is $100 million, up to $100 million in relief. I know there's a lot of questions about how we're going to make sure that money doesn't potentially overlap with some of the city money, because some of the city has some of the CDBG money has flowed directly to the city. And then we've also got private entity money, which are sometimes going into these buildings and or to renters. And we just, right now, we don't have clarity on whether or not there are systems in place.
I think one of the things that makes me ask that question is during the coordination, when this crisis initially hit, there was a lot of jockeying for position between the city and the state, right? This is closed. No, it's not. Oh, now it's closed. You know, the press conferences being moved up and down. When you have something as essential as housing, I would imagine you need that kind of coordination to make these things work. And I don't know. Okay, what about when you were, did you see that kind of coordination happen when you were actually in government?
I think Adam's got a piece of this. Adam, you want to chime in?
No, all yours. I'm loving this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's sometimes it's a little more complicated than that, because the city is one actor in the state. It's also the biggest actor in the state. Depending on what is happening, depending on the housing topic, sometimes the city is driving a conversation that the state is having, being the leading entity. So I think the state and the city electeds, advocacy efforts, and government are very much aligned in the call and need for rent relief at the federal level. That's one place I would say we do see some synergy across the board. I think all of us are like, this is absolutely necessary. How can we communicate this? The city being the biggest player, obviously, is one of the leading voices in that. But then there are other times where the city's interest is very different than what would happen in the rest of the state. Right. So the city accounts for, I think it's more than 2/3 of the overall renter population of the state. So our interest for what that means for us, what relief looks like, and if relief were to be evenly distributed across the state, obviously is very different.
So we see some synergy in the calls for federal assistance, as you mentioned. Do we see any signs, Adam, then from the federal, any positive encouraging signs from the federal government in terms of providing that assistance, providing that guidance at all?
No. It's been brought up in the House. It's died in the Senate. You know, it's not a renter or, you know, our federal housing structure is not one that is terribly supportive of high demand locations like New York City. And not just housing, but you know, and it's unfortunate because,
or is that related to?
No, not at all. Not historically. I mean, the New York City Housing Authority is a good example. All of the HUD programs of the 1960s and 70s were really targeted toward what was, you know, really the last sort of, well, the last, who knows what the last was. It was the last externally obvious racial upheaval in communities of color. And the programs were largely designed to address that. I mean, they, as mechanisms, as self-sustaining things, they weren't particularly useful. And one thing that we've learned, I wanted to just, I will throw Barika a little bit of a life preserver on the discussion. You know, the one thing that we've learned since the 1960s and 70s is that there is a way to harness private capital for housing. When I started doing this in 1989, New York City's taxpayer funded 100% of every project that we did.
Okay.
Even as late as the beginning of the Bloomberg administration, New York City's taxpayer was funding 2/3 of every project that we did. Now that number is down to, on a good day, it's a third. Maybe on a bad day, it's 40% that the New York City taxpayer contributes through the capital budget, really, whether it's bonded or not, but let's just say in economic terms of the financing sources of every project, which is to say, putting it a different way, that the private sector has stepped up. They have reason to. Maybe they don't do enough. I fear what happens if the Community Reinvestment Act goes away. But, that's a great equalizer. And the city and the state share that sort of public-private partnership that Barika's organizations and for-profit developers work within. It's not like a purely government-funded enterprise. It is a true public-private partnership.
Barika, we have a question about the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which is, I think the governor has until tomorrow to sign this. Some tenant advocates have criticized it for sort of allowing money judgments, right? So you can't be evicted, but you can go into debt under this measure. Your thoughts on that bill and the chances that it flies or it goes through?
Oh, I don't know the chances that it goes through.
Okay.
I think the only people who sort of ever know the destiny of a bill are the inner group that is negotiating it up in Albany for New York State. I would say that's a general good rule. But I think the huge concern here is really rooted in a lot of the conversations around racial justice, and the concern that by allowing the bill as it currently is, and allowing money judgments, that we would be putting Black and brown communities in a place of indefinite and further debt, right? I think when you think about the numbers, let's take a household that only has a rent of $1,500, and take 3 months. That means that they owe $4,500. And we know that in reality, most households across the country, nationwide, regardless of their income, can only absorb $500 to $700 unexpected costs by going to a credit card. Right. So the idea that any individual, especially the low-income households, these are disproportionately households that are making less than $40,000 a year, are going to be able to somehow come up with $4,500 at any point in time is basically, it seems absurd.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of it then, because we're talking, the discussion here is about what the industry can do to fix broken systems. So let's be optimistic. Give me something that can be done that can address some of these issues. What can be done? What
can be done? What I would
Sure.
say to your audience is that every single person in your audience, regardless of what sector they are in, needs to be making their voices heard, and calling their allies in other states to say everybody needs a rent relief bill. New York State, we're talking about a total statewide rent bill of $3 to $4 billion a month. There is just no scenario where developers, tenants, or any intermediary or corporation in between is absorbing that for the 4 or 5 months that we've been in this, and potentially another 3 to 9 months that we could be. That's just it. We know that is not where we are right now. And so what we absolutely should all be saying is we need DC to act. And that shouldn't just be limited to tenants who are worried about it being evicted. That shouldn't just be limited to landlords who are having trouble with their operating costs. That should be everybody recognizing that we put our entire New York City and New York State economy at risk if we don't address this.
Right, and there's been fears about a second wave of job losses, right? The initial one was sort of companies reacting, okay, wow, we can't, advertising fell off a cliff, for example, demand and travel fell off a cliff. But as we reckon with how deep this recession could get, there is, concern that there's going to be another wave of job losses that could be even more significant than the first one. Adam, let's get your take on that, just in terms of principles that the industry can look at to move forward and talk about it as a developer, as someone who's got a loan, as someone who's operating, whatever perspective you want to take, let's hear it.
Well, I think one system that I don't think anyone is particularly happy with is housing court.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a ludicrous exercise, and I think if I were, you know, a tenant lawyer, I would probably say the very same thing, as opposed to being a housing provider and operator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we spend a lot of money, a lot of time, you know, as a not-for-profit with a social service enterprise. We spend a lot of time one-on-one with with housing counseling and arranging for payments, but the process and the degrading process that residents of ours, customers of ours, have to go through, and the adverse position that we're placed in, even in, you know, it's especially awful now. But it was grueling and a waste of time and money and effort before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as I said, you know, folks who provide right to counsel representation, for the most part, would agree that there's got to be a better way of resolving the dispute that arises when a private party providing a home, you know, fulfills its bargain, and someone doesn't.
What do you propose?
You know, I think there are a lot of good alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. First of all, in this crisis, any landlord who would try to evict someone is insane. Like, that would be, for an affordable provider, it's particularly idiotic because it's not as if there's a gain to be had by having an empty unit. And so we are doing, you know, collaborative agreements with every resident that raises concern with us right now. You know, collections have been okay. We're able to operate our buildings. I worry a little bit about the end of the enhanced UI benefit at the end of July. I think a lot of people are looking at that as a potential cliff. You know, I think my mind goes to, how do we make this less adversarial? How do you put, you know, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms in to more swiftly connect a tenant to rent payment? Because, you know, only in the rarest of circumstances is a tenant, you know, in anything other than financial distress. You know, holdover evictions are, you know, are non-existent.
Let's talk about the main sort of use cases.
Yeah, and then the second thing that, you know, as Barika mentioned, it's an enormous obligation just for New York, to say nothing of the nation, to provide a voucher to pay someone's rent. So when I hear situations like that, and to think of practical solutions, when legislators get, you know, terrified that they're going to be out $50 billion a month, or some staggering figure, I think about the advantages of financial guarantee, and the leverage ability of a government standing behind someone, and, you know, a risk sharing mechanism that makes, just if I were a policymaker, which I'm not, it makes the government's money go further and gets most of what you're seeking, and, to put it differently, avoids 80 or 90% of the problem, and doesn't necessarily, and reserves the resources for those who are in most dire need.
Okay. Barika, I want to end with something I mentioned at the top of the hour, which was, we're having this conversation about racial justice and equality now. It's at the center of things, as opposed to even though those task forces are still being constructed, there is very much, it's in the national consciousness in a way that I don't think it's been for a very long time, a few decades, like before my lifetime, for sure. So there's been momentum. We're seeing momentum on the corporate side in terms of representation and leadership, and there's all these questions being asked. From the housing side, what is the most, again, encouraging, interesting thing about this conversation, and how do you plan, and, you know, associations like yours plan to take that momentum and create something?
So I would say, I mean, first, not to come in with a pessimistic response to your very uplifting question, but I would say I am cautiously hopeful. And I think that that's rooted in the reality of being a Black woman and having my own personal, but then also generational experience of America starting to move forward on something and then oftentimes walking away, if not breaking people's hearts. And that is in Indigenous populations, many of our POC communities, many of our LGBT plus communities. Like, that's the reality, I think, of being a person who has been marginalized in our society. I think the hopeful part, though, is that there is a momentum that I have never seen in my lifetime, very similar. And I think for housing, we have a very different conversation than maybe parallel, but very different than I would say a lot of other sectors need to have, because at our fundamental root, very, very fundamental base, housing is rooted in racism. There's no question that our entire property system is rooted in keeping some people out and allowing other people access.
You're not just talking about redlining, you're talking about lending, you're talking about
all of it. Lending, right? So I think that there's a lot of conversations we need to have. Who is leading developments? Where are they happening? What mortgage rates are people getting for home ownership opportunities? How does that shut them out of markets? What does cash offers mean? And how does that impact people's ability to create multi-generational wealth when we know homes are one of the primary assets? And who gets to plan for what happens in certain places? And how can different people have the power to impact that discussion? And right now, that is all racialized. It's all tied to race, it's all tied to wealth, it's all tied to privilege. That's the reality of how things unfold right now in New York City. And and across the country, if we're gonna start to move and make changes, we have to recognize that that's where we're at now, and then start to make some decisions that shift that. And I think that's a tough conversation to have as a
right, and it's a freaking overwhelming problem as well, right? If you chip away at one thing, I get it, and then you go to the next. But you were talking about just looking at it all, and then how do you attack it? Like, how do you even get there? Is I think something all of you will be grappling with over the next few months and the next few years. So, as always, any discussion like this leaves more questions than answers. But I definitely thank you very much for your time, Barika Williams, Adam Weinstein. Thank you so much.